Good morning once again. Welcome to Innovation Bay's Wednesday morning event series. I'm your host again this morning. I'm Ian Gardner. I'm a co-founder at Innovation Bay. I'm also a VC investment partner with Gelix Ventures. Also in the Innovation Bay team, always want to give a call out to them. Faden Stow, my co-founder, Shan Priest, our general manager, and Claire Tester, who's our event manager. So thank you guys for being part of the team. Now, the good news this morning, I've upgraded my internet connection and I replaced my crappy router, which apparently should be pronounced router, but I'm still sticking with the Scottish router with a decent one. So I've had a few connection issues in the last few weeks, but I think they should be fixed. So I think we're all good today. Let's talk about what we're doing afterwards. Just quickly, we've been trying this virtual networking for a few weeks and it works pretty well. So if you want to come and meet some people and, you know, it's not quite a full replication of face-to-face random meeting, but a little bit, join us on Discord after the session. It's pretty good fun and there are some good people there. So please come along and join us at 9 a.m. once we've finished here. If you haven't heard of Innovation Bay or if you're new here, then welcome. We are the longest running community group for founders and investors in Australia. Our mission is to support founders on their journey from idea to IPO and beyond. And we do this through a range of events, programs, and other content designed to enable founders, people to connect, learn, and grow with each other. We couldn't do any of this without the support of our sponsors, so I do really want to give a big thank you to AWS, IAG Farmark Ventures, Macquarie Bank, and KPMG High Growth Ventures for their support of Innovation Bay, and they do some amazing work around the whole startup ecosystem and generally, so give them some love and support, check them out and use their services. Okay, this morning, I've been pretty excited about this. Very topical, cybersecurity. It's a vital part of the digital world. And I think we have seen its importance. It's been underscored by recent cyber attacks on Australian government, or maybe it's just the fact that we're calling out the cyber attacks and individual businesses. So I think everyone's at risk in some form. The global shift to remote working, reliance on cloud storage, all of this has emphasized the need for really sophisticated security systems. Now, over the last 5 years, the Australian cyber security ecosystem has begun to emerge as a bit of a leader. So there's some great companies coming out, and we've got some of them with us this morning. So we've got 3 founders and a fantastic investor who's invested in the sector to talk about this and how we as an ecosystem can continue to grow this momentum. So let me stop sharing my screen and meet the panel. Yeah, so let me just do a quick intro and it's in no particular order. So Casey Ellis, he is the founder of Bugcrowd, normally based in San Francisco, Casey, but you're in Sydney right now. I think you managed to escape the carnage a few months ago. So let me just, sorry, my screen has just frozen. So Casey, here we go, I've got it. Yeah, founder and CEO of Bugcrowd. It is a crowdsourced bug finding software company. You got customers like TransferWise, Seek, Netgear, Motorola, several other. You've raised over $100 million from Blackbird, Costa Noa, and your StartMate alumni. So back in, I think, 2013 or 2012?
2013, about 7 million years ago.
Yeah, I should know. I invested in that round, so thank you for your success in that. James Cameron, investment partner with Airtree Ventures. I think you're probably one of the harder core geeky ones there. I don't know whether that's being fair to you or unfair to the others, or what form of that, or whether that's just mean or not. You've backed some amazing businesses there. You're behind the investments in Prosper, Huddle, and of course, cybersecurity heavyweight Secure Code Warrior, which has been an amazing investment. I mean, it kind of put 10 times on its valuation within a year, if I remember right. From I think you invested in 2018 and reinvested in 2019. So amazing story, that one, which hopefully we can touch on. Jessica Glenn, I've known Jessica for a long time. She's an amazing lady, serial entrepreneur and a builder. You most recently built and exited Tammy, which was an AI and analytics platform for double-sided marketplaces. now spending most of your time working on other difficult engineering problems and frontier tech, such as high-speed detection algorithms, path prediction, robotics control, outlier fraud detection, and one that I just discovered this morning, high-powered lasers, hopefully not attached to sharks. And you recently did a full teardown and analysis of the government's COVID Safe app. So that was a great write-up you did there, and very useful for us all. Mike Baux is the founder and CEO of Upguard. That's an enterprise software business reducing cyber risk, preventing breaches, and protecting the world's data. Customers, including Apple, the Australian government, NASA, New York Stock Exchange, Akamai, IAG. You've raised over 40 million bucks, including from SquarePeg, August Capital, and again, another StartMate alumni. So yeah, look, terrific panel. I'm delighted that you're all joining us. So welcome, welcome panel. All right, let's jump into this. Mike, I might start with you, with a bit of a geopolitical angle. I mean, cybersecurity has been all over the news at the moment. State actors seem to be at the center of that. If you think back a few years, there was Stuxnet, which was a cybersecurity weapon deployed by, in theory, the US and Israel to target Iranian nuclear weapons facilities. Australia was, talking pretty openly just in fact, right now, about being the target of a state-sponsored cyber attack, potentially in the theory from China, but nobody's actually pointing the finger at them. Russia's interfered and influenced the US elections. The North Koreans and China have got armies of geeks who are trying to target other states. How worried should we be about all of this stuff going on?
Well, I think the federal government's announcement this morning and yesterday kind of should set the scene for what we're expecting. If you kind of look at where we are regionally, we're kind of reliant on the United States ultimately for, as an ally for protection to some degree. And if you look at the rising, tide in China, we rely on them for financial mechanisms and economic growth. So we're kind of caught in this weird middle balance at the moment. If you really look at what's going on, the sheer amount of data that we're generating year on year implies that cybersecurity concerns are at the forefront of it. Now, I think that as we're beginning to see, we're beginning to have more and more digital incursion on our own sovereign nation, or attacking our critical infrastructure systems, be it IT, be it OT, any of those capabilities. And I think the overarching perspective that we've got to realize is that the way that the world was isn't anywhere near the same as what it is now. So unfortunately for us, we're caught in between two regional superpowers, one emerging, one in existence. That peer competition is rising dramatically. And as a result of that, we're beginning to, ultimately be forced into a choice of what we believe in. And ultimately, as a result of that, we need to really understand the alliances that we're choosing in the future. So from our perspective, I think that, we're probably going to see more of this in the future. We should certainly be worried about it. We should be worried about it for not only for our, personal safety and the safety of those that we love, but we should also consider the fact that the economy is going to be starkly different as we begin to ramp up more and more defense capability and really come up with a set of conditions by which we respond aggressively to digital incursion. So, Morrison's announcement this morning regarding, increased defense spending, taking it from 2 points to, whatever it is, 2.2, maybe 3%, is a pretty stark warning sign to a lot of other regional powers in the area, because, it means that we're not going to really put up with being bullied. We are going to, respond back. And as a result of that, you have to really think about the Australian psychology of dealing with that, because traditionally wars have been fought remotely and in far distant places, but it kind of feels as though now the Pacific Theatre in particular is engaged in a Cold War, and more importantly, Australia is kind of right at the forefront of that. So there's certainly concern, but it also feels as though the Australian government's stepping up and doing the right thing about it.
Yeah, and so I mean, a lot of that increased defense spending is going on people to, as we talked about, these armies of geeks just trying to protect or attack. I think, is that fair to say? That's where the spend's going to go?
I think it's the way that I read it, and I haven't seen the detail in any form yet, but from what I can tell, they are looking at increasing the ACSC. They're looking at, the ASD and increasing funding there, and they're looking at bringing up more and more regional centres to be able to deal with this. Now, that's a really good start. I don't think it's enough yet. I think that based on what we're seeing, we're going to see an increase dramatically over the next 10 years. I suspect as we begin to see a rising economic power in China.
Yeah, right. I mean, fascinating stuff. I mean, I could talk to you all morning about this, but I think I want to hear from the others as well, and make sure that we're covering lots of topics. Casey, I might jump to you and just ask you about Bugcrowd and how you and your company fit into all of this. So, because Bugcrowd's got a fairly unique business model and way of working. So maybe tell us a little bit about that and who your customers are.
Yeah, sure thing. And thank you for having me on. So yeah, Bugcrowd is effectively really the thesis that we operate off is that cybersecurity is fundamentally a human problem. The technology just makes it go faster, right? Like the idea of people introducing vulnerabilities as they make design decisions or build things, that is a phenomena that predates the internet by a couple of thousand years. And then adversaries taking advantage of that for whatever reason they have has been around for quite a long time as well. So we're in this position where that's being accelerated by the adoption of technology just right across the board. And there is this fundamental last mile problem of being able to get access to adversarial creativity to basically outsmart and stay ahead of the adversary. So what we do, we've got a community of coming up on about 250,000 hackers right around the world. And then we've got a platform where our customers basically access all or part of that community to find vulnerabilities in their stuff. We basically gamify that and pay them based on success with cash and social recognition. What we've since done, since launching the company itself and seeing the rise of the concept of bug bounty and vulnerability disclosure on the internet, is carved out different ways to actually consume that creativity from the crowd to basically deploy it to other security problems. So ultimately, that's where we're going as a business. We've made significant steps towards that over the past 3 years in particular. But from a customer standpoint, it's right across the board. I started the business, I've been in security my entire career, basically since high school. And, was kind of noodling on this idea of like, how do you level the playing field? How do you create the kind of resourcing and economics that are available to the adversary and make it available to the defender? And around that time, Google and Facebook were starting to make some noise about their vulnerability reward program. And it's like, well, why don't we just do that? Why don't we intermediate that and actually operationalize that on behalf of everyone? And obviously that had its kind of ground zero in Silicon Valley, which is where we went. But what we've seen since is really that concept jump out of, the Bay Area kind of crazy tech startup sandpit. We work now with companies like, Fiat Chrysler, for example, MasterCard in the financial services sector. In Australia, we work with like Seek, Atlassian Services, New South Wales, right up to like Department of Defense in the US. We've been, very heavily involved in the topic of securing the 2020 election in the US, which is this whole other very long set of rabbit holes to talk about from a NatSec and cybersecurity standpoint. But really, it's like, if there is a crowd as the logical solution to the problem, that's what we're here to actually facilitate and deliver out to the market, which is what we've been busy doing for the past 8 years or so.
Yeah. All right. No, that's awesome. It's a great business. So yeah, good on you. I mean, it's been an amazing success story. I remember when I first met you, I was like, why would individuals volunteer to do this? And I think you've shown that there is a model.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even that's an interesting one that comes back to what you were just asking, Mike, because I think the internet collectively has reached a point of acknowledging the fact that vulnerabilities are just a product of being human. We've got people writing code, building businesses, doing all those sorts of things. Like, we're creatively powerful and amazing as a species in doing that, but we also don't get it right every time. So the idea of like actually anticipating that, seeing ahead of that, catching those things as they happen, and then mitigating and learning from them, I think that's something that, 8 years on, most people are at least a little bit better at than they were when we first started.
Yeah. Jess, let me jump to you. And I get like, I confessed to the panel before we started, I'm not an expert in this area. I don't wake up in the morning thinking about or worried too much about cybersecurity. I mean, I do all the basic things like two-factor authentication and, Dashlane or LastPass for your password management, all that good stuff. But most people don't wake up in the morning thinking about cybersecurity. Does that mean that we are too complacent as a society or an ecosystem. And I guess, you know, what should we do to improve the public's awareness of threats and protect ourselves?
Sure. So yes, we're too complacent. You said that you use 2FA and you use Dashlane, and that already puts you in the top 6% of people, right? So we've been going on and on about this for maybe a decade, that the single greatest thing that you as an individual can do to secure both your company, your privacy, and the nation is enable 2FA. And still we've reached 6% of people, or 6% of logins.
Really uninitiated out there, like just give us a quick, what is two-factor authentication?
Two-factor authentication just means that when you try to log into something, instead of just typing in your password, you type in your password and then you either use a code from your phone or you get an SMS. Essentially, it just says, let me find a second method of verifying that you are who you say you are. And it's a really simple way that people estimate would reduce about 70% of attacks, or 70% of successful attacks.
Yep.
If we could get people to do that, that would have a significant impact. Both from a NatSec point of view and also an economic point of view.
Yeah.
How we get there is hard. I think that we need to do better at reaching outside of tech. Traditionally, tech has been very bad at doing that. And I acknowledge that I am also not very good at reaching across to people who do not share the same experiences. I say that even though I haven't always, like I didn't always wake up in the morning and think about cybersecurity. I started off in banking and had a whole department that dealt with that. And then the first thing that we built was in AR. And in AR, it was really nice and confined and there wasn't a lot of data. It wasn't until we got onto VoIP systems that we had our first large distributed attacks against our hardware. And I went, oh, that's actually a problem. And then we went from that to large, expensive, multinational distributed systems. And obviously nowadays we work across a large range of really difficult research projects, some of those which touch defense, which means that we have a very different surface area. So it's been a learning experience for me as well over 15 years. And I've got to say, I never used to wake up in the morning thinking about what we need to do to increase our cybersecurity. I do now. It should be front of mind for people that run a business. What can we do to help? I'd say my experiences have changed with what Australia's capabilities are. There's two things that I've noticed as I've grown up in this ecosystem. One is that if you're a large business or you're in the defense community, ASD actually has some really good outreach programs. They have some really good help for trying to make sure that you're secured. I'm hoping that with the $500 million that's going to them to put 500 new people on, we can see that scale, so that there's more outreach for smaller business and for everyone else out in the community. The other thing is an increase in sovereign capability. So we're seeing $1.35 billion being spent now. We're seeing an increase in defense budget. Hopefully that rolls out into an increased investment in the community in Australia as well. Increased sovereign capability tends to bring increased awareness with it, and also means that no matter what's happening through our government, you've got this stable, commercially accessible almost layer of companies that are there to protect us. So I think those are the things that we can do to help protect. And if I had one message that everyone that was watching this could take away, it's please enable 2FA on everything.
Yeah, because I mean, there's a couple of questions have come in that, like one from Andrea Gardner. What can we do to cheaply boost our security?
Andrea.
Yeah, she's in the back room over there. So, and I think she might be out walking the dog. That's the best thing about Zoom. But yeah, what's the, I mean, cheap way is like, it sounds like two-factor authentication and password management. I mean, is there anything else that we should all be doing in terms of just quick security?
If you're an individual, two-factor authentication and password management. The second thing off the rank, if you've got 2FA, is making sure that you're not sharing passwords across. Like you should have one password per login. That's ideal and really difficult to manage in today's world. So use a password manager. It will make your life a lot easier. If you're a business, most businesses are working with some form of cloud platform. Yeah. Whether that's Office 365 or Azure or AWS or Google Cloud Platform. And I have to tell you, they're fantastic. They will actually, if you send an email in, they will send an architect out or organize a Zoom call these days to turn around and sit with you and go, what's your architecture like now? How do we fix it? Where might you be insecure? And what can we do to try and improve that? So you should be taking them up on that.
All right.
Absolutely use those resources.
I would add to that as well, in just using, this, especially as we're all kind of working from home, and variations of how that's going to return to the office are kind of in question at the moment. The idea of making sure, like, running around your home network and making sure that devices are updating, or getting the technologist in your family or whoever to come in and help you out with actually doing that and setting it up. The other thing I would say there is services like Cisco Umbrella, which I think used to be OpenDNS, or even installing something like a Raspberry Pi hole for the average user that's a bit more technical. Like, those kind of measures are quite cheap, but what they do is basically interfere with some of the things that would be able to install malware onto your computers at home. I think that's a fairly cheap defense. It's fairly effective and becoming a lot more relevant in 2020.
Yeah,
I'd probably add to that and say, start using 2FA to Jessica's point, but probably start looking at using a Chromebook or some variation like that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, just keep your...
Or just an abacus, like, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Our fax machine. Let's go back to faxes. All right, James, I want to get your view as the investor in the panel. I mean, hopefully, I think obviously there is money to be made in this space. I think we've got two of the greatest Australian cybersecurity companies on here. I mean, we've got Cyrise, which is an accelerator at Melbourne, and of course, Secure Code Warrior, which you've invested in. So how's Australia doing on the world stage here? So it seems that we're good, but the world's a big place. So tell us about where we are.
Yeah, happy to, and thanks for having me on. I think my camera's just frozen. Listen, I must say it's always pretty humbling being a VC up here on a panel with three people who actually do a real job for a living, rather than just hang out on Twitter like me and pretend I know what I'm talking about. But you asked me to provide a VC perspective, which is usually the good thing about being a VC is it's usually, when I walk into a room, I'm the dumbest person in the room, and we can embrace that. That's a good thing. It means we can ask a bunch of questions and try and get a little bit smarter. But we do spend a lot of time looking at VC from a investor perspective, obviously. And I used to, before I started at Airtree about 3 years ago, my old fund Excel, I used to cover cybersecurity and sort of split my time between Israel and London. And so obviously I sort of have comparison points in both of those ecosystems. And listen, to be honest, it's still got a long way to go. The funding, if you look at funding in this ecosystem, which is a pretty gross proxy for activity, but it's sometimes a useful one, it's tiny. I mean, other than a few blips from time to time with big investments, it's usually sort of around $5 to $10 million a year goes into cybersecurity companies in Australia, which is the size of a small Series A in the US, a single one. So I've still got a long way to go from that perspective. But one of the first things I did when I got back to Australia was try to wrap my head around what was going on in the space down here. And I wasn't expecting a ton, but I was definitely surprised on the upside. I think we do, for where we are, we're punched above our weight. We have some incredible success stories. We've got two of them on the call here. Threat Metrics is another clear standout. They've had an exit, over $1 billion. DTEX has raised about $80 million total, and just announced a big raise the other day. And you mentioned Secure Code Warrior. And there's a whole other generation coming up sort of behind them. Companies like Casada and Sidearm and Asset Notes are all looking pretty interesting. So there is a lot happening on the early stage sort of product focused founder ecosystem, and a lot of the building blocks are in place. Right, we've got a lot of great technical talent. I read in the latest AustCyber report that I think we rank 4th in the world in terms of cybersecurity related patents, which actually just blew my mind how far that's come. And in terms of citation impact, the number of times that those patents are cited, we're actually number 1, which is kind of staggering. And you mentioned accelerators like Cyrise. I saw Scott on the channel somewhere here. AustCyber is playing an important role for connecting up all those various stakeholders. a lot of the good work there has been done, and I think we would expect that to translate into more and more activity for us as investors and for founders down the track. But there's no question there's still roadblocks, right? I think the big one is the skills gap. Everywhere you ask any country in the world, do they have a cybersecurity skill gap? And they'll of course say yes, but I think it's particularly acute here in Australia. We're always top or close to the top whenever you see surveys of how easy it is for businesses to find cybersecurity professionals. And that's a tough thing to build. Like cybersecurity skills aren't the sort of thing you can learn from a textbook. There's Australian universities and programs out there that are trying, but real world. This is an area where real world experience matters. And this is, people often ask, so what can we learn from places like Israel where there's an abundance of cyber skills? I think the answer is unfortunately not very politically acceptable. The answer there is really they have conscription into the armed services for 3 to 4 years for every 18-year-old in Israel spends time in the IDF, and 1/3 of those 18-year-olds go into Unit 8200 or Unit 81, which is the equivalent of the NSA or ASD here in Australia. And so when you've got that level of talent all moving through the chief cybersecurity organization in a country, you can't help but have a huge amount of talent go off once they graduate and then go and spin up startups or go work in large organizations as cybersecurity experts. Obviously, that's something that would be a little dicey to propose here politically, but there is some stuff we can learn there. There's fantastic opportunities to do public-private partnerships and have some of those skills that are coming out of the ASD. And the ASD has been training, great security experts since 1949. It's well regarded globally. Have more public-private partnerships so we can have people sort of come in and out of ASD and come in and go out and spin up startups. We've seen a lot of startups in the UK and the US that have spun out of people who have come out of GCHQ and the NSA. So I think that will be encouraging, and that was a positive note on the announcements yesterday. I think the other point is I think we should be playing to our strengths. Australia is not going to be able to create startups or skills across every area within cybersecurity. We have always had particular strength, and it's useful to play to those. I think things like developer-driven security. Australia's got a deep bench of developer tooling companies. Sort of the Atlassian was the ship that floated an entire industry there, and really that's companies like Secure Code Warrior who are in that space, who are helping developers become better at writing secure code. That is an area that I think we will continue to be strong at. There's other areas like, we have some of the strongest quantum computing talent anywhere in the world. We have, within about 10 square miles of me here in Sydney, we have 3 of the sort of premier 50 universities in quantum. And so there's a real opportunity, sort of quantum encryption and developing that further. We've got a couple of great companies working on that right now. Yeah. So I think sticking to our strengths and trying to fix that skills gap are the 2 of the biggest things. But there's some great green shoots, and it's an exciting place to be an investor.
All right, great. That's a fantastic overview. Thank you, James. Mike, I want to jump back to you. And kind of the state, weaponized cybersecurity stuff. I mean, the Australian government, Morrison's been talking about it, and particularly pointing the finger, I think fairly explicitly, at China. I mean, is there substance to this? Have we always been under attack by China? Is it just politically expedient that we're now calling it out because there's a bit of a trade war going on? I mean, what is happening with China is maybe the question for you, Mike.
Well, I think what we're seeing is an emerging superpower that will and potentially could dominate economically the position of the United States, in the future. And I think that what we're seeing that application of power begin to extend to other countries around it. So it's no surprise that India 2 weeks ago had one of the largest cyber incursions occur. There's no surprise there that they're fighting on the border. There's no surprise that that they're also attempting to gain access to Australian resources. And it's predominantly a source of control in the future. I think it's closer to bullying tactics at the moment, but I think that over the last 2 to 3 years in particular, we've seen more and more arguments indicating a political war is underway. And, the constituents, in this country in particular are beginning to realize that warfare is beginning to wash over us at a political level and at an enterprise level. So I suspect that we'll see more of it. The interesting thing about it, though, is that, in conjunction with all of the other statements that have been made around, what the Australian government's investing in strategically, this whole concept of Australia needing to stand on its own, I think Hugh White talks about it a fair bit in that, in a publication called How to Defend Australia. A lot of the strategy and the communications that are coming out of that seem to be, cascading appropriately, but more importantly, are showing us a different perspective on what it means to be Australian in an uncertain future, and with particular regard to the focus on the presidential campaign in the US, what the potential could be there, what does it mean for an isolationist view in the Americans, in the Americas, and then particularly as a result of that, what does that mean? How does that leave us as Australians with a potential strategic military ally pulling back progressively, and then how do we effectively defend ourselves from that? So I think that, and more importantly, how do we defend ourselves against, incursion, but then at the same time, how do we defend ourselves from an economic perspective? And I think what we're beginning to see is that, China's making moves in this regard. They're quite aggressive in the way that they've been talking about foreign trade. They're quite aggressive in their, they're basically colonizing the South China Sea. I suspect that we're going to see a lot more of this as Australia begins to step up and build alliances with India, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia over time. So I suspect that we're going to see a coalition form. I suspect that we're seeing the first parts of this groundwork being laid. The missile defense system that was touted this morning in the Australian is a really good example of us really shoring up our ability to provide Australia with the capability to not only invest heavily in autonomous naval systems, military, air naval defense systems, but then the whole concept of maritime denial will probably start occurring on Australian soil, predominantly around digital denial. And then what does that mean? Then how do we retaliate effectively? Australia's got a really good experience, and I think James alluded to this prior, of high quality cyber capability. And I think now we're going to see that push to the forefront with more investment. So that's kind of the view that I've got.
Yeah, interesting. Anyone else want to talk? I mean, I don't want to spend too long or too much more time on the whole geopolitical stuff, but I haven't asked anyone else here. Casey, have you got you're doing some elections.
It's kind of. Go ahead.
No, just what's your view on this?
Yeah, I think the geopolitical implication on cyber has really kind of forced itself into everyone's thinking. I think traditionally national security, you're either a nation state target and you know it, or you're not and you're kind of vaguely concerned and aware of it, but it's not as high on the radar. Like even with COVID, seeing pretty widespread and deliberate incursion out of certain players to basically firm up their persistence just from a recon standpoint, to be able to keep an eye on what's happening from an R&D perspective around a cure for COVID, or even to understand what's happening economically in different countries of interest. Like there's this interface between cybersecurity, cyber incursion, and then some of this kind of trade war stuff that I think COVID has, frankly, these things have always been on the cards, but I feel like this year has served to accelerate them and decentralize them in a way that basically smashes them into our space pretty rapidly and brings it up into the radar of the average business. The other thing I would say as well is that there's been signals, even from a work from home standpoint, a ODay and a router. You can buy that for $10,000 to $15,000, and they typically don't sell because no one's interested in owning people's homes until this year. So there's activity happening on that side from an offensive standpoint, and that's cyber criminals as well as nation states. I think to speak to ASD, there was this kind of weird thing that happened, I think it was April or so, where, the ASD came in and basically took care of a bunch of like COVID-based lures and phishing sites that were targeting the Australian population, which was odd to see, because if, the Australian intelligence community or military do something like that, they don't tend to talk about it in the press. But they came out and actually confirmed that 2 days later, which to me was a really strong signal to some of the foreign intelligence units that, yeah, we're here like with a very serious intent to defend ourselves using force in the digital domain if it's necessary. I think that's really signaling a strong intent to not be pushed around as a nation, and I think we're in a position to actually do that. And I think some of the signaling is a good thing. It's obviously, needs to be treated with care, but the fact that we're heading in that direction, for all the reasons that Mike just mentioned with what's happening in the US and elsewhere, I think is actually a really important and a positive thing. All
right, cool. I know there's some questions coming in. I can see them lighting up, but if anyone in the audience has got a question, just stick it in the Q&A function or in the chat, but let's go Q&A. Let me maybe bring it back a little closer to individuals and businesses. And Jess, I might ask you this one, what's the worst that can happen? Have you got any horror stories about, shake us out of our complacency here? Why should we take this seriously?
I'm always mindful of horror stories because there's a really good rule of thumb, right? If you're a target for a nation state or you're a target for very serious cyber criminals, as a general rule, like you're very hyper aware of your threats. The largest horror stories from a commercial point of view, a great one is just a couple of weeks ago is Toll. Toll shut down, couldn't do anything because of a ransomware attack. This is a large multinational corporation that has a very large IT team, is very capable, and was completely shut down. They thought they were out of it, and then it went further, and then they wouldn't pay the ransomware, so it became a data breach. The entire thing was shut down. That's from a commercial point of view. If you don't get this right and you are large enough that you are a threat, your company will stop. That's the worst case scenario. From a national security point of view, I think we've touched on a couple of things here and we need to split them out. We speak about things like agitprop and online radicalization as being part of cyber these days, whereas they're more, traditionally they fall more into a counter-intel style role. And then we talk about cybersecurity as being how do we build walls that are, you can never build a perfect wall that will keep everyone out, but at least that deters most people. We need to split those. The worst thing that can happen from an agitprop point of view, and agitation, nation states trying to agitate change and coups, etc., is what you've seen the CIA be able to do in South America, etc. You can topple a country from doing that incredibly well. From a cybersecurity point of view, you worry about national infrastructure. The worst case scenarios are shutting down power grids, are shutting down critical infrastructure. So those are horror stories. Those are what we need to protect from. They're not everyday occurrences. Everyday occurrences tend to be more widespread. So for instance, what's recently been happening with China, supposedly China from what we know, is to turn around and go, okay, well, let's put as many tentacles out as we can. Let's do this broadly, and then let's see where we end up. We're going to put a lot of pressure and just see what breaks, what we can find. Yeah, hashtag not China. We're going to see what we can find, and then once we've infiltrated, we'll see what we can do from there. That's more either as Mike I think said, either a bullying and standover tactic to just say, here we are and we're big and we can do this, or just an exploratory thing to go, okay, well, what can we see? What can we find? That's more of the day-to-day. From a how do we get past that, I think Mike was right. The ANZUS Treaty has treated us incredibly well, but the nature of the world has changed significantly, and we need to develop more sovereign capability to be able to protect from that. $1.35 billion, half of that going into ASD is great. 500 new ASD jobs is fantastic. ASD do a remarkable job And as Casey mentioned, they tend not to go around and take kudos for all of the work that they do. But we also need to make sure that we're spending money on developing the commercial side of that. So we should put this in perspective. If we need new planes, it costs $17 billion. If we need new submarines, it costs $225 billion. When we need to create new cyber, we need to be going, okay, well, how do we do tens of billions of dollars in a commercially mindful way? And Australia faces a relatively unique difficulty with that. We don't have as many incumbent, sovereign, capable businesses. So we need to go, how do we grow this? And there are some, I mean, Defense is doing some great things with this. CDIC and Plan Jericho in particular do great at taking very measured bets on small enterprise. But we need to put large buckets of money into trying to extend that capability so that we can grow Australia's sovereign capability.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, Jess. That was a good answer. Casey, I might throw this one to you. And it's a question that came in from Reese Miller. At what point does an organization become a high target for cyber attacks?
Yesterday. I mean, look, it's this goes to, I think we talked a lot about what the average consumer and the average person could do around their personal security. The number one just generic piece of advice I give to any organization when it's thinking about how to up its game is to go through a threat modeling exercise, like understand what are the assets that you're protecting, from a data standpoint, like financially in terms of the information flows that you manage. What are the likely threat actors that are involved, and then what are the different tiers? Like, here are the folks that we can reasonably expect will rock up and monkey with our stuff. Then here's the next most likely group, and then there's others. And then work out if you've got fences set to the appropriate height in the appropriate places, and not to advocate moat and fort security, but conceptually speaking. It's different for every organization. Like healthcare, for example, is notoriously crappy at security in terms of like hospitals and even EHR providers and so on. They just haven't been at the forefront of this for quite a long time, especially when you compare it with financial services. And in part, it makes sense because their job isn't to protect their data; it's to protect the patient, right? But all of a sudden, COVID shifts the math on that, and we're all searching for a vaccine that's going to be incredibly lucrative from a financial standpoint. So, patient data and results are of interest to someone who can actually make use of those as an actor. So it's constantly shifting. I think the answer to that is really going to be a big "it depends," which I hate giving as an answer, but this is where the JCSC, which is an initiative out of the ACSC for basically threat intelligence and vulnerability sharing, like those types of initiatives that the Australian federal government's starting to try to push on more and encourage use of. I think those are actually critically important. I say that as someone who started a crowdsourcing company, so I think this is a fundamental way to solve problems that I am predisposed to believing in the first place, but it really is a team sport. So the idea of being able to understand from others in your vertical, what are we seeing? Is there a sudden spike of interest out of a certain APT group, or are there like cyber riffraff coming after our customers more than normal for some reason? Being able to collectively see what's going on and respond reactively, and then ideally move to a point where you can be a bit proactive about what you expect. That's something that I think that any organization can do.
And Mike, you got any thoughts on that? I mean, you protect businesses as well. Like, is there a way of staying more under the radar, or does it not make any difference because we're all at risk?
Doesn't make much of a difference. To Casey's point, there's strategic reasons why a target emerges. I'll give you a little insight. We've got a report coming out next month that looks at the ASX 200 in particular, and we've done about 3 years worth of this data analysis now. And for as near as we can tell, with as attribution, and I'll point out attribution as best as we can, roughly about, I think it was last year it was roughly about 26 to 27% of Australian companies that are listed on the ASX are leaking data, some form of sensitive credential, some form of open access to a database, etc. That number has jumped to a little under 34% in the course of 1 year, with the majority of that occurring since, I think it was December. Wow. So this rapid ramp up, roughly about 30 to 35% of the ASX is exposed. They're leaving themselves vulnerable and open. And it kind of makes it really, really easy for a nation state or a state-sponsored, attack vector, threat to take advantage of that information and make it easy. I think it's more about how easy you make it for someone to take advantage. And I suspect that, companies in Australia aren't quite conscious of that yet, but I suspect they will be soon.
Yeah. Let's maybe just change tack for a sec. James, I might jump to you as the investor here. I want to make sure we cover a couple more investor-related questions. So, I mean, beyond just investing in cybersecurity companies, how do you view, as part of due diligence, this is sort of with your more broad Airtree hat on, cybersecurity when you're thinking about that, and therefore any tips for the audience, most of whom are founders, I think, on what they should be doing?
Yeah, it's not a huge part of our due diligence, to be fair. I mean, we're investing in companies that have, usually fewer than 10 people when we first meet and invest in them. So it's very rare that they'll have anyone dedicated to cybersecurity. It's even rarer that they'll have sort of an infrastructure. They certainly don't have a CISO or a SOC team or anything like that. So we don't dive too far into inbuilt capabilities, but we'll definitely look at a few things. I mean, we've had both at my previous fund, Accel, and here we've had plenty of companies that have had pretty big breaches. At Accel, we had Slack and Lynda.com in the same year. Both lost. Both had breaches for about sort of 50 million or plus records. And just last year, Canva was hit for 140 million hit in the Airtree portfolio. So we've definitely seen it, and it hurts, right? I think for a while you're at the top of the news cycle, and depending on how you deal with that, it can be better or worse. I think there's a lot of lessons there, and I think to Casey's point, doing a proper threat analysis and it maybe even goes one step further and having your continuity plans and your comms and messaging plans in place, ready to go for when it does happen. I think Canva was probably rightly criticised after they were breached for the 140 million records, that they came out and emailed everyone with what sounded, at least in their first couple of paragraphs, with a fairly marketing-driven email, and buried the lead, which was change your password, right at the bottom of the email. Don't do that. Go straight to the point. Be straight up with your customers when you do have a breach, and help them remedy it. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing is most of the companies we work with, most of the founders on this call will be building software products, and for them, investing heavily in tools to help your developers code more securely. And there's obviously a blatant and very biased shout out for Secure Code Warrior, which does exactly that. But there's beyond that, companies like Snick.io to help you look after vulnerabilities in your code. And there's a whole category of other DevSecOps tools that will help you enable and empower your developers to do better things. And it's important, right? A huge number of the vulnerabilities that are being introduced to codes are not new things. These are things that have been around for 30 years, and developers just haven't previously had to care about them, because in the old dynamic of software production, you would build a version of your application and you'd throw it over the fence to your ops and security teams to do the audit before it got thrown over the fence to their customers. And so they wouldn't have to care about writing secure code. The reality is today you're pushing code out, on the hour, and you don't have time or the capacity to pass it through a security team. So your developers have to be the first line of defense for security, and they have to write secure code from day one. And so for most of the startups we invest in, making sure that they're investing in enabling their developers to write more secure code is probably the biggest single thing that they can do to help themselves.
Yeah. All right, we're into the
add to that just briefly as well as ops becomes more a function of the development team. Like we're at a position now where you've got, folk deploying infrastructure at a massive scale that don't know what the OSI model is. And as a result of that, the internet's sort of starting to look like it did back in like 2001. So even more to your point, the whole idea of like the acceleration, the accessibility of infrastructure and code, and the fact that there aren't those traditional gates in place. I fully agree with what you're saying, James.
And put a 50K bug bounty on with Casey's crowd. That's one hell of a good way to get to figure out.
And then train them on what we found with Secure Code Warrior. So there's your fist bump right there, mate.
All right. Well, look, 5 minutes or so left. I mean, there's a bunch of questions. I don't know whether I'm just looking at the panel. I mean, you're all pretty geeky, so you're probably looking at the questions coming in. So if there's a choose your own adventure, then jump in with them. Otherwise, I'll jump to a couple more. Is an interesting question from Adam Jajong. Explosive proliferation of connected devices, IoT. So any perspective in the IoT cybersecurity risks? Who wants to take that? Jesse?
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly. We hack a lot of IoT connected cars and medical devices, home vehicle, home automation, all that kind of stuff. Probably the big thing with IoT is kind of what I was getting at before. Like it matters now. It's always been a bit of frankly, a shit show from a vulnerability standpoint because of the speed with which these things go out to market. Speed is the natural enemy, I think, of quality, and security is a subset of that. So IoT has traditionally been quite vulnerable. And now it matters because the home is a part of the corporate network. So it's been, I think we've gotten away with that to this point because IoT has been exploited mainly to build out botnets and do that type of thing. But now it's actually useful for corporate espionage.
And just quickly on this one.
Sorry, I was distracted by an email that came in.
At least you're honest.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got really big news coming in the next day or so. So
okay, go.
Yeah.
IoT.
Do I think that the explosion of IoT creates a significant hazard for business? Yes, absolutely. We're in the process of fitting out a new facility at the moment. We have to have separate networks for anything that we want that's IoT in there. Whenever you introduce something new into your network, especially in a home network, you need to be aware that IoT is one of the most significant vectors. And buying cheap IoT does not pay off. In particular, I think IoT is one of those areas where you can find something for $40 and it's more likely to do you $400 or $4,000 worth of damage very, very quickly. Connected, like one of the largest botnets was on IoT internet IP cameras. Right, was using the little CPU that was on there to create a distributed large chunk of compute power. I think that was incredibly impressive. The ability to listen to
default password, do they?
No, nobody does change their default password, but also, I mean, there are printers that create an open port, that automatically try and create an open port connection with the internet to make your life easier, and it's about user experience. But there was someone, I can't remember this, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, that printed off on 1,000 people's printers a little thing saying, by the way, your printer's completely insecure. Maybe one of the other panelists will remember that, but that was fantastic, and it's very true. We introduced these things into our system. We do have autonomous connected cars. We're building some stuff around one at the moment, and it's incredibly difficult to actually secure that and still provide an open and easy user experience for connection.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely be mindful. Keep a separate network if you can.
Oh,
don't buy a baby monitor with an IP address, and even worse, don't Google why you shouldn't do that. It's pretty horrible.
Well, just to your printer point, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the early days of fax spam. Don't know whether anyone else came across that, but yeah, you're all too young. Anyway, it's ridiculous. Let's maybe.
I think we've all heard the legends of it.
Yeah, yeah, it was pretty bad. Let's maybe take one more and then see how we go. Interesting one here, James. I might start with you in this one because I'm sure you've seen plenty of companies. I've come across a few as well. So it's from Carl A. Passwords. Is password the best tool? Because there are alternative ways of logging into devices. So expanded passwords, please.
They're broadly pretty shitty, right? I think in 10 years' time, I'll be very, very surprised if we're still using the same password setups that we have at the moment. We've seen tons of companies. We invested in one at Excel that was trying to kill the passwords, and it's still trying to kill the password. So it takes time, and it takes a lot of integrations with a lot of different parts of the internet. It'll happen, and I think in the meantime, password managers are a great sort of workaround to get you to a similar state, whilst being much more secure than your own using your own password for every single application. All
right. Anyone else? Right. Okay. Let me ask one more. I lied. I'll maybe make this the last one. It could be quite a big one. So let's try and keep our answers quick, and I'll try and keep the question quick. I mean, the Australian government, and we'll finish in the government. I mean, it has been a little bit heavy-handed with some of the laws, like they had a backdoor encryption law, the terror laws with holding companies responsible if they post stuff or their users posted stuff on their website. A lot of people would say they're a little bit ignorant when it came to how they thought about that and how they deployed it. Does this suggest that we can't really trust the government to be good with the stuff they're talking about with cybersecurity? Mike first, and then let's have a quick answer from everyone.
Look, the Australian government has a messaging and marketing issue. I think a lot of the capability that that we're talking about here has existed in other analogs before. Telecommunications Act's a really good example, eavesdropping, all of that. How they position, these new types of laws and, the types of integration with, commercial entities is pretty, it could somewhat suggest that it's ignorant. However, I would suggest that the intent is exactly the same, and it's even more important that we kind of open up to this type of capability in the future, because I suspect that our national sovereignty depends on it, particularly as we're entering a more politically charged Cold War, it feels as though. So I suspect that there will only be more. I pray and hope that they get really good at marketing it and making sure they understand the implications of it to a more generationally advanced, group of people. But I suspect that they can and will manage it effectively. They just need to get better at marketing it to the population.
Anyone else want to take a pot shot at the government? Jess, you...
Yeah, I would say, we're a democracy, so part of our job is to trust but verify, right? For the folk that have input to give it. Like, keep an eye on this stuff as it comes out, and hold the government accountable, and actually, get involved in giving feedback, because they aren't going to get it all right. Like, you don't have a bunch of digital natives running the country. That's just a practical truth of the situation. And I think the same thing is true everywhere. So, like, work on the assumption that, our feedback as constituents and citizens is important. And obviously we can reflect that in our vote. We can reflect that ahead of time by actually trying to help out as these things, go out for comment periods and so on. Like we saw that with the AAA bill, and we'll see it again.
Yeah. Jess, I'll give you the last word, but if you can do it in 15 seconds, that'd be good so we can finish in time.
Trust but verify is incredibly important. We exist in a very new world that's very dangerous. There are increased scales of capability around agitprop, around online radicalization. We have a new concept of privacy. The concept of privacy is relatively new. And the idea of perfect privacy isn't possible. I think that we need to trust that at least the incredibly good people in the intelligence community are doing everything that they can, and we probably need to find a way to have a robust national discussion about where that line is, what we're prepared to cede in order to give them the tools that they need to do to protect us in a new digital world.
Yeah. All right, look, we are at time, so I do want to make sure we get everyone away. So look, that was fantastic. I learned a lot, which I love. That's part of the reason I love doing this. So James, Mike, Jessica, Casey, thank you so much. It's great to carve out an hour of your day and join us for this. So thank you. Let me just wrap up. I'll share my screen here, and I'll just tell you what has been going on here. So we have released a new podcast episode. In fact, I should probably talk about it next week. We're taking a week off I think I alluded, this is episode 13 of this particular event series. So yeah, like when the pandemic hit, we kind of, this Innovation Bay, we reacted pretty quickly, and we sort of went into, crisis mode, I suppose, but now it's a little more steady state. But we have delivered a ridiculous number. It's like 50 or 60 events that we've done over the last 3 months, which is a lot. So we're a little bit tired and washed out. So we're going to take a break next week. 2 weeks time, we have a panel on food, which is this one here. So how do we feed 10 billion people by 2050? Pretty amazing panel. We've got Olympia from Gaterra, Rolf, who's the CEO at one of the founders at Marley Spoon. So amazing business. I mean, they're turning over almost 200 million bucks, I think now. Sam Wong from Blackbird and Shama from Sunfed. So a really amazing panel. Looking forward to that. We've got a panel the week after that. We haven't got a slide for it, but we're doing one on e-commerce. And then on the 29th of July, we do have Larry Marshall from CSIRO in a one-to-one, which I'm very excited about as well. So Open the Pod Bay Doors is our podcast. Every 2 weeks we do a news special. We recorded one yesterday, which was terrific. Really enjoyed it. We had Adam from Ordermentum, Paul Smith who's a tech editor at the AFR, and Sarah, who's one of the founders at Tenacious Ventures, which is an agtech focused VC. So check out the interwebs and find that one. That is there. We'll see you on Discord, I hope now. So as soon as we wrap up here, we'll jump on there. And then finally, look, a huge thank you once more to our national sponsors, Macquarie, KPMG, AWS, and Farmark Ventures. So that is a wrap. So thank you, everyone, for coming along, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks, panel, and thanks, audience.